Stephen is the president and CEO of LFA Group, Learning for Action. Stephen founded LFA Group as a vehicle for deepening the impact of and enhancing sustainability among social sector organizations through highly customized research, evaluation, and strategy services. Over the course of 17 years, Stephen has provided these consulting services to hundreds of nonprofit organizations, foundations, and public agencies alike. He's regularly sought out to present at conferences across the U.S. and abroad on the topics of cutting-edge approaches to evaluation and evaluation capacity building, as well as integrating an outcomes orientation into strategy development processes. Stephen's content expertise covers diverse issue areas, including youth development, K-12 education, early childhood education, health disparities, housing and homelessness, civic engagement, and community economic development, among others. We are pleased to have him join us today and present his session on finding common ground using evaluation frameworks to communicate with funders and other key stakeholders. I'm going to bring up his presentation now. And take it away, Stephen. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah Jo. And good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. And thank you very much for joining us to talk about how we can use evaluation frameworks to communicate with funders and other key stakeholders. I wanted to open the session by sharing a few key messages that I'm hoping that we all take away from the session today. At LFA Group, Learning for Action, we view evaluation and strategy as two sides of the same coin. And we view that coin as the very coin that you need to run your organizations and programs, the funding and resources to operate and sustain your work effectively. And so what I'm hoping that we will accomplish today in part is to see how evaluation can support your fundraising and sustainability efforts. Given that we have a limited amount of time to cover a lot of material, I wanted to share up front three core messages that I aim to communicate over the course of our time together. The first is that evaluation is a critical component of effectiveness, period. If you read any literature on management and leadership, you will find reference to the need for data and facts for any manager or leader to keep an effort on track and successful. So while many of us have resisted evaluation because of, well, for many reasons that I know are very practical and real, evaluation is a fundamental and critical component of effectiveness. The second key point is that this is really about the dog wagging its own tail, that your organization will always be playing catch-up and that game of chase the dollars unless you bite the bullet and build your internal capacity to engage in an evaluation. The third key point is that theories of change and logic models are the building blocks of evaluation and of fundraising. And I hope that you will see today how you can connect your program logic models to foundations strategies articulated in their theory of change or logic model. So with those three key points, I can share now the presentation goals. I'm mostly hoping to inspire your efforts to build your evaluation capacity and to support that inspiration with some knowledge and familiarity with evaluation frameworks as tools for evaluation, but also for communication. I will provide you with resources to help you take a step in the direction of using evaluation tools and frameworks. Specifically, in addition to this PowerPoint, there also is a handbook on evaluation for organizational learning that there is a link to at the end of the PowerPoint. And lastly, this is about empowering you to become the dog wagging your own tail, as I indicated. So in the spirit of the inspiration goal around your evaluation efforts, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about why we should evaluate our efforts in the first place. We break down the purposes of evaluation into two overarching fundamental points. The first is to is to prove. This is the accountability and fundraising purpose of evaluation. And under this purpose, you are able to measure and demonstrate your effectiveness, even demonstrate social return on investment, so to speak, and identify what works and inform replication of program models that are effective and worthy of scaling to more broadly address the social need or issue that you're working on. The second fundamental purpose of evaluation, of course, is to improve, and this is the learning and continuous improvement purpose of evaluation. This is what I consider to be the primary internal place of motivation for nonprofits to engage in evaluation. This is about informing and improving your practice, about informing and improving your program planning and design processes, your strategic planning and decision-making efforts, and then, of course, beyond your work to inform the field. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, this notion that we often are dragged into evaluation because a funder is requiring it, I feel strongly is the message of the past. It is, while it is still many of your current experience, the nonprofit of today and tomorrow is the one that embraces evaluation and builds its internal capacity to engage in evaluation work on an ongoing basis. So given those purposes of evaluation, let's talk a little bit about what evaluation can do for you in your organization. Thinking about how evaluation data can be used, first as a communication tool about your program, evaluation will help you capture your work and your impacts at both the individual and community levels. Of course, this is dependent on your having frameworks in place to measure individual level change and a logical framework that connects the work of your program to broader community level change as well. Evaluation also helps you make the link between your activities and your intended outcomes, which demonstrates the strategic use of funds. It also helps you identify the small steps of progress, the interim outcomes that we can achieve over time, and connects those interim outcomes to longer-term, bigger picture, and to funders, ultimately more sexy and attractive outcomes that we intend to contribute to through our programmatic work. Also in the communication, as a communication tool, evaluation data can help make explicit what you hold and know implicitly to be true. And I find this to be very common in the nonprofit sector, that our training in social services and in the content of our work and in our experience in providing the services and doing the work that we do, we have an instinct and a gut feel about what is working and the degree to which we're making change. We see change in participants. We see expressions in audiences' faces. But to make explicit what you know and believe to be in your gut and you see anecdotally requires evaluation data systematically collected and systematically analyzed and presented. And then as a communication tool for the field, evaluation data also can help inform what is working, creating knowledge about effective practices and disseminating what works. It also raises public awareness of the issues, needs, or assets among the communities that we are working with, because evaluation not only tells us about what has changed over time, but it also tells us what work is left to be done. So I'm going to move into discussing the building blocks of evaluation. These frameworks of the theory of change, logic model, and evaluation plan are what we consider to be the building blocks of evaluation. I will go over the fundamental frameworks, and then we'll take a break to see if there are questions on the content so far. My experience is that the theory of change and logic model terms are used interchangeably in the field. And I think that this is fundamentally caused by a lack of clarity around the difference between a theory of change and a logic model. And while these two frameworks have very similar core components, they fundamentally do serve different purposes, and this is key to understanding how you can connect your evaluation frameworks to funders' efforts to support your fundraising work. So I will briefly just cover what I consider to be the differences between the two frameworks. The theory of change model I find to be most useful for broader efforts, for larger efforts, such as that as an organization as a whole, or initiative that involves multiple strategies coming together to achieve a similar set of outcomes and impacts. So theory of change, again, I see as a broader, more of a bigger picture framework capturing the work of an organization or an initiative. Theories of change also tend to include more contextual factors that might affect success, and we'll discuss what some of those contextual factors are. They tend to be high-level overviews of strategies and outcomes, and while, of course, your logic model also will contain strategies and outcomes, I find the theory of change model to be most useful and have high communication value, which is the fourth point of differentiation, when the expression of the theory of change is kept at a higher level of generality and less specificity relative to the logic model. So moving to the logic model framework, again, what it shares in common with the theory of change, both frameworks express the work that you're doing and connects that work to the outcomes that you intend to achieve. But the logic model is a framework that I find most useful for individual programs. So it could very well be, I encourage organizations to consider an ideal state, which in my opinion would be an organization has a theory of change articulating its set of strategies and how those work individually and in concert to achieve a set of outcomes. And then perhaps each strategy or each program within an organization would have its own individual program logic model. The logic model generally does not include contextual factors. It may, but doesn't necessarily. It does include more specific detail on activities and outcomes. In particular, I find the logic model to be a good place to outline your the time sequencing of outcomes you intend to achieve from short-term to medium-term to long-term. Logic models have high implementation value, whereas theories of change have high communication value. And by high implementation value, I mean both for programmatic planning and implementation purposes, but also for evaluation implementation. So taking a step back to define a theory of change, I've hinted at the components of it, that it does include your strategies and outcomes. But to share a formal definition, a theory of change is an articulation of the conditions and interventions needed to bring about a desired outcome or set of outcomes. So the notion of the conditions and interventions both brings into play the contextual factors, the environmental context, the political context, any other contextual factors that may be at play, as well as the strategies and activities you're engaging in. A theory of change is typically presented as an easy-to-access, at-a-glance graphic that depicts relationships among the components of the framework, and we'll look at some examples. and as I mentioned, it's generally most useful for an organization or an initiative. Here is a kind of template for a theory of change showing the components of the framework. I personally am not very dogmatic about how these things actually look in the end. I find that the most useful theory of change and logic model are those that an organization feels a strong sense of ownership over. And so if you're not a boxes and arrows kind of organization or person, then please feel free to customize and riff on this template as much as you are comfortable doing so. But I am showing here just the core components, that there generally is some statement of the problem or need that you're aiming to address, or the change that you're seeking to achieve, just in a narrative format, maybe an if-then construction. And then describing the environmental context that you're operating within. What might affect the success of your work, either positively or negatively? What are you working against? What assets exist to support your efforts? To clarify these so that as you communicate about your work, it is clear what you're up against and what you're working with. The evidence and assumptions box on the bottom is a place where you can identify either the literature and previous research that supports the approach you're taking, but also the values, beliefs, and principles that you're operating on, given your own experience and your knowledge of your work in the communities you're serving, can also be evidence that supports the strategies that you're engaging in. So that leaves the last two components, which really are the heart of the matter, and that is the strategies that you're engaging in, what approaches you employ to achieve your desired results, and then, of course, the desired results themselves, what you expect to change as a result of your work. So those are the components of a theory of change. And here we see an example of a theory of change. This is a mock example that we've put together for a made-up foundation called the Green Foundation. This is their environmental education grant-making program. And I am showing you a foundation's theory of change because I want to then show how you can use your evaluation frameworks to connect to it. But the idea here applies equally to your work and your organizations, that you may have a set of guiding principles that you would like to articulate and clarify that is part of the context of your work. And then, of course, there's the broader field context. Now, you can already see that this example doesn't follow precisely the template that I shared on the previous slide, but that simply is reinforcement for the point I was making earlier, that what's most important is that this resonates for you, that it contains what you feel is most important to communicate about your work. And so these guiding principles and field context pieces feed into the set of interventions that the Green Foundation is intending to support and does support through its various strategies of research and evaluation, field building, messaging, and integration and alignment. Those are what this foundation considers to be its systems change efforts, grouped together under that heading. And then there is a direct programmatic effort, which is around stewardship and promoting environmental stewardship among young people in particular. So you can see the flow of the theory of change in this example is from the top to the bottom. The strategies each contribute to a set of outcomes that are articulated on close to the bottom of the page. And the systems change outcomes contribute to and feed into the desired change among young people, which ultimately has to do with greater stewardship of their environment and improved conservation behavior. ultimately aiming to create a greater citizenry that is more engaged in conservation behavior and more environmentally literate. So you can see that this theory of change has the outcomes and strategies expressed at a fairly high level. There's a bit of detail in the strategies to clarify what these headings mean, but the outcomes are not time sequenced in a very detailed way. They're at a fairly high level, although it is showing here how the systems change work does contribute to intended individual change among young people. I often get the question of what's the relationship between the ultimate desired outcome and either your organization's mission or vision, and it may very well be that they are one and the same. It is essentially the same notion. What are you ultimately trying to achieve? So I'm going to run through logic models. As I was indicating, they share a core and set of components in common with the theory of change, the connection of activities and outcomes, but they're slightly different with more details. So a logic model is a representation of the relationship between a given set of activities and the outcomes expected. It's usually a more linear model with arrows and boxes, generally moving from left to right, as we'll see in an example. And as I mentioned, most useful for programs, individual programs, rather than larger sets of connected strategies. So a logic model contains the following components that we see on this template: an articulation of the overarching goal of the effort, and then a set of linked components, starting with the resources and assets that are necessary for successful implementation of the effort, connected to the activities that are the major efforts or strategies being undertaken, leading to the outputs of your effort. Now, I find a lot of confusion between outputs and outcomes, generally speaking. Outputs are what are created or produced by your project activities. These are things like a curriculum that has been developed, the number of people that you've reached, the characteristics of those people reached, the number of sessions that you may have provided, or the number of viewings of a particular artistic exhibition. Those are the outputs. They're the concrete, tangible products created by your work, as opposed to the outcomes, which are the short, medium, and long-term changes that your project aims to achieve. And those are intended to ultimately add up to your impact. Now, a couple points about outcomes and impact. First of all, one useful strategy for being sure that you are referring to an outcome when you intend to, as opposed to an output, is to attach a change verb with your articulation of your outcome, such as increase or decrease, improve, enhance, expand, reduce. These come an outcome from an output, where, as I say, there generally is a lot of confusion in the field. And to differentiate outcomes and impacts, which also tend to be used interchangeably, I would just offer 2 points of differentiation. An impact is a change that generally occurs over a longer time frame, I would say greater than 5 years. I tend to use, as a definition for short-term, change that occurs in a 0 to 1 year time frame, medium-term, 1 to 3 year time frame, and long-term is a 3 to 5 year time frame, generally speaking, as I use these terms, whereas impact is 5 year or beyond. That is one point of differentiation. It's the time frame across which the change is happens. A second point of differentiation for impact is the level at which the change occurs, which is to say that outcomes are generally programmatic based, so the folks who are participating in your program will experience outcomes. Impact tends to apply at a more community or population level. It may not be measurable as a result by your individual program just because of resource constraints and the scale of doing such an evaluation effort to measure community impact. But also there is, of course, the reality that your effort is not the only one, generally speaking, affecting the kinds of change that you're trying to see at a community level. And so it often is not even appropriate to measure impacts. But it is critical to show how your work contributes to impacts, because ultimately this is what funders care most about, impact at the community level. So I was in a presentation by a kind of management guru out there in the field at the Center for Effective Philanthropy conference a few years ago, and the way that she put it was that if you don't line up the short and medium term steps that are required to achieve along the path towards a greater impact that we all care about, like reducing poverty, addressing the achievement gap, increasing the cultural awareness and sensitivity among a community that we work within. If you don't identify how your work in the short term adds up to the longer term impact, that work loses meaning. It is important to identify the steps along the way to a bigger picture change so that the work along the way gains meaning and value. So before I stop for questions, I just want to show the example of the logic model that we're sharing as an example of a program-level logic model. There actually are two that we'll take a quick look at. So this is the Best Environmental Education Organization's Research and Evaluation Logic Model. This organization engages in research and evaluation to build the environmental education field. And if you recall from the foundation, the Green Foundation's theory of change, there was a research and evaluation component that they were aiming to address. So what I am showing here is how you and your program can develop your logic model in alignment with a funder's theory of change, their evaluation framework, but further specify it in terms of your work and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Now, a couple points to make on this example. Number one, you'll see that, again, it doesn't include the resources and assets, nor does it include the outputs that may be achieved. And that is because I am primarily aiming to show the importance of the time sequencing of outcomes to flesh out a funder's broader framework into a framework that is more specific to your programmatic work, to show how you can contribute to a funder's intended outcomes in their strategies. So I just want to point that out, that if you are developing your own logic model, you will want to include also assets, resources, and outputs as well. I was afraid that if we included so much detail, we wouldn't be able to read the example on the screen, though. So each of the programmatic areas within the research and evaluation component of this environmental education organization's work has its own stream of outcomes that flow from short-term to long-term to ultimate desired outcome. And sometimes they interconnect with each other and flow from one to another. And these connections are just as critical to share as is the left-to-right time sequencing from shorter-term change to longer-term change. Taking a look at second example, this is whereas I'll just click back briefly to comment that this research and evaluation logic model is, of course, not traditional direct service kinds of work. It's more about knowledge development that can be used for advocacy and awareness building and field building. So I wanted to include an example that was not direct service. And then also to include in the stewardship program logic model an example that is directly related to service provision. And this is about direct environmental education in the field. And you can see that the activities here are youth environmental leadership and stewardship activities. There's an emerging environmental leaders network and professional development program. And there's a citizen science program, each contributing to a set of outcomes that flow here across time and ultimately contribute to increased conservation behavior in communities served. So I see that there are a few questions, and this is exactly the point at which I wanted to stop and address some questions.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So there are some questions coming in, and the first one is from Haley. Would it be a good idea to include variations of a logic model in grant proposals and or reports?
Well, I think that is an excellent question, and I would say that there are a couple instances in which I've seen organizations include variations of a logic model in their proposals and in the reports. In one case, it was where the organization wanted to have a version of their logic model that they felt was more consistent with who they were as an organization. It was a multi-service organization that serves low-income communities, and they wanted to have a logic model that was in very much plain English and did not look like the traditional box and arrows logic model. So they had their non-traditional version and then a traditional version more like the template that I showed you. But from another angle, variations in a logic model might show different points of emphasis. It might show how the work is organized by activities, such as the examples here, or it might show the work organized by the target population that you're trying to reach, more along the lines of the framework we were looking at for the foundation, where it was broken up by youth versus work that was being done in schools with providers. So thinking about showing your logic model based on the targets of change is another way to vary the approach and to communicate in different ways about your work to your funders and stakeholders.
Great. The next question is from Rosian. Steve, can you give some examples how organizations combined learning from evaluations and communicating? In my experience, you can learn a lot from evaluation outcomes that at the same time are hard to communicate.
Indeed, yes. There are a few examples that I have about this issue of learning from evaluation and communicating about the results. I think the best examples that come to mind are ones in which the organization really engaged key constituents in discussions about the learnings from the evaluation as a strategy for coming up with the key messages for communicating about the work. So, typically I think evaluation results come in and, in a good scenario, we have program managers, program staff, and executive leaders all looking at the information and trying to make sense of it together. That is an ideal scenario. But to go further and to take the evaluation results to the place of being kind of fit for broader communication, I think it's really in that process of making meaning with them together with program staff, as well as key constituent groups such as the clients that you're serving, and engaging them in this discussion about what you found and what the results mean. That is the most effective way to kind of get reflected back to you what the key messages are and how to communicate about those messages to others in the field.
And Allison is asking, which model do you think would be more appropriate for grants that request plans for evaluation?
Excellent question. I do think that it is more common for foundations to be familiar with the logic model framework, and I find that the logic model framework is the most, or the more common, I should say, of the two, between logic model and theory of change. It's the more commonly requested. Now, that said, I am finding that there's a set of foundations out there that kind of consider themselves to be sort of on the cutting edge of philanthropy, those who are involved in social entrepreneurship, the venture philanthropists, I'm sure you've heard these terms out there. They are increasingly using the language of theory of change, but my experience is also that they are not clear on the technical differentiation between a theory of change and a logic model. So that said, I think if you were to focus on the logic model framework as the key framework for communicating with funders, I think you'd be in a good position, and I say that largely because funding tends to happen at the programmatic level. If you're engaging a funder around a different kind of investment that is broader about your organization, possibly operational support or more flexible dollars than program-specific dollars, then the theory of change is more appropriate. But 9 times out of 10, I think the logic model is the more common and appropriate framework for fundraising purposes.
Thanks for everyone's questions. This is the last question we have in our queue from Kirk. If this example were continued, would you include one logic model per intervention as listed in the theory of change model page?
Yes, that is exactly right. And in fact, that is what we have in our full stable of examples and tools. I just didn't include all of them in the presentation today for the sake of brevity. But yes, you would. I will just quickly go back to the theory of change example. And so each of these 5 dark green boxes under interventions would have their own logic models. And similarly, in your organization, if there are 4 broad programmatic areas, then I would expect that there would be 4 logic models that you would have developed. So good. Thank you for the questions. They're very helpful to gauge where you're at with the material and what additional information is helpful for you to know. I want to continue on then to keep getting more specific in our evaluation planning here and move from logic models and theories of change into talking about evaluation plans and evaluation planning. This is really where the rubber hits the road, and you go from the frameworks that are good for communicating about your work to evaluation implementation, where you would actually have the data on results to share the progress that you've achieved and the outcomes that you've accomplished. So an evaluation plan really is the next layer down, getting more specific about the work, translating your logic model outcomes of interest into evaluation questions and specific measures for data collection. The evaluation plan essentially provides a roadmap for data collection and instrument development, and it brings discipline to your evaluation approach. It makes sure that all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. So I find that the best way to talk about evaluation plans is to show an example of one. There are a couple points that I want to make in showing this example. This example is for a youth development program, just to cover a slightly different content area than we've been discussing with the other examples. You see here that what we do in the evaluation plan is identify for each outcome, so in this case, improve savings behavior among youth, we identify what questions we want to answer through the evaluation process. So this improved savings behavior among youth is rooted in the questions of how does youth savings behavior change as a result of the program, and what progress do youth make towards their saving goals? And by framing these as questions, we can then specify the outcome into a set of indicators. Now, indicators is another one of those evaluation 25-cent terms that gets thrown around a lot, but is often not defined very clearly. I find that the easiest way to explain indicators is to describe them as how you'll know it if you see it. So how would we know if youth savings behaviors changed? Well, in this example, the actual saving behavior themselves, the amount that the youth is saving, the dollar amounts. What dollar amount have they been saving prior to the program? What dollar amount are they saving since participation in the program? The savings assets, so the absolute amount, would help us know if behaviors had changed, if they are building assets. The monthly savings goals, setting a goal and whether it's being achieved. Those are what indicate whether savings behavior has changed. By specifying outcomes into indicators, we can attach data collection strategies to those questions. That is what is so useful about the evaluation planning process, and the reason why getting as specific as indicators is so important. So we see here that we can collect savings behavior data on youth surveys, and we can establish goals through youth applications, and we can understand achievement of goals through youth focus groups, for example. And so the point here is that this evaluation planning process gets you to the level of measurement. It gets you to the degree of specificity that you understand what piece of information you need to collect, and then given what you need to collect, how can you best collect that? What is the best data collection strategy? One additional point I want to make about the process of going from logic model to evaluation plan is that your evaluation plan should have both a process evaluation component and an outcome evaluation component. Now, what I mean by that is if we look back at the logic model, I'll actually go back to the template here. Process evaluation is the use of evaluation data collection to understand the processes of your work. What level of effort are you engaging in? Are you implementing the program as you intended it to be? How many people are you reaching? All of this is process evaluation. And so the first three boxes of the logic model here, from resources to outputs, essentially are what constitute your process evaluation work. Understanding whether the resources and assets that are needed for the effort have been brought to bear upon it sufficiently, whether the activities have been implemented in the way that they were planned and intended, and whether you have accomplished the set of outputs, whether you've reached the number of people, provided the number of sessions, developed the tools that were necessary to achieve the program's work. That is your process evaluation effort, and it should have its own evaluation plan. I will say that a lot of times, whereas in the outcomes evaluation plan that we looked at, which of course specifies the outcomes part of your logic model, whereas measuring outcomes often requires additional effort to collect data from your program participants, and is often where we tend to look to third-party resources. The outputs should be trackable over the course of your work through through sets of logs or tracking systems. The issue is that I find that we don't always determine at the outset what those data elements are that we need to collect, and so we aren't as systematic about collecting those process data as we could be if we were to engage in a full evaluation planning process from the start. So I will just click back to this evaluation plan slide. I see that there are some questions that have come in, and let's break to respond to those and see if other questions come up.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stephen. Christine asked a question, actually. She's asking if there's a grants-based resource, which is grantspace.org is a Foundation Center website, that speaks to who ought to be at the table during the process of putting forward a list of evaluation questions. And I was actually just searching GrantSpace, and you can search our knowledge base for the just evaluation or program evaluation, and you'll see a number of resources coming up. But I would really love for Stephen to address that question as well. Who should be at the table during this process?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah Jo. What I would encourage you to do is to download the evaluation handbook that I will click to the last slide to show you the link here on the final slide, LFA Group's Handbook on Evaluation for Organizational Learning. If you click on this link, it'll take you to our publications page, and the handbook is there. There are a few sections of the handbook that speak to this question. And so if you look at some of the tips that are there for developing your logic model and tips for developing your evaluation plan, I think you'll find some guidance on who should be at the table. Now, all of that said, I would say that just for the benefit of everyone who's listening in this morning or afternoon, as the case may be, that I think that developing evaluation questions can happen at all levels of an organization. I certainly would be certain to include board members in the generation of evaluation questions. What is on their mind? What would they hope an evaluation would answer? But then also through various other levels of the staff portion of the organization, from executive leadership to management and direct service line staff. And this is coming from my perspective, which is that evaluation is most useful when folks are engaged at all levels of an organization.
Excellent. And Stephanie has a question, too. What is the best way to use these models for already existing programs?
That is an excellent question, and I should just comment that I want to normalize Stephanie's experience in question, or what's implied, that you may have a program up and running possibly for years, and it may not have a logic model per se. The first thing, so that is very common, and in fact I would want to say that 9 times out of 10 that is what our experience is. I want to first say that just because you don't have a logic model down on paper doesn't mean that you aren't operating from a logic model in your head and on your team. That the model isn't existent. It just, generally speaking, hasn't been put down in this format. And this allows me to make the point that really these tools, I believe, are most useful for providing a framework for having an outcomes and results-oriented conversation at your programs and with your staff. And so if you don't have a logic model in place for an existing program, I would encourage you to access the logic model development worksheet that we have in our handbook that is available to you. It walks you through a series of questions that I would essentially use as a kind of group discussion protocol with staff to gather folks together and have a discussion about the work that we're doing. How do we want to talk about it? What change do we see happening as a result of our work? What change do we want to have, even if we're not seeing it? And how well aligned is the set of activities we're undertaking with that change? So I think these frameworks are wonderful opportunities to engage in very meaningful conversation with your teams about the work that they're engaging in, and having a framework for systematically capturing and articulating that work in a way that will allow funders and other stakeholders to see the degree to which their interests and priorities align with yours.
Excellent points, and we do have more questions coming in too. Should we keep answering and answering questions, Stephen? Okay.
Let's do.
So, for large organizations, for example, a school district, how much of the development should exist outside of current practice?
Let's see. For larger organizations, how much of the development should exist outside of current practice? And I'm going to take the question to mean development of these frameworks and an evaluation plan. And I would say that I would have 1 foot grounded in current practice and 1 foot grounded outside of, stepping outside of current practice, meaning that when you take a step back and develop these frameworks and put them in place, your experience and your current practice should be a touchstone for you around what you have seen work and what you have seen change as a result of your work. But I wouldn't be constrained by current practice. In fact, this is a real opportunity for you to step outside of what's known and familiar and take a look around at the landscape. What are other organizations and efforts doing that are similar to what you're trying to do, similar to what you're trying to achieve, but taking possibly a slightly different approach, a new or different or innovative approach? I think there's another aspect of this question about, to what degree should this be done internally? To what degree should it be done externally? And I think that, again, consulting with external stakeholders is an excellent idea if time and resources permit.
Excellent. We're going to keep answering questions, but I do want to ask everyone for their input in evaluating this presentation and this workshop. So I've gone ahead and put up our wrap-up slide, so asking you to please complete the feedback survey. You can click on the Zoomerang link there, or I'll also bring it up for you by clicking at the link as well. So we really appreciate your evaluation of this evaluation workshop. One other question, or two other questions at this point, you can keep them coming in. What about including clients' perspectives? How can we make it a more bottoms-up approach? What are the risks, rewards, and processes?
I love this question. I am a big proponent of including client perspectives and of bottoms-up approaches in general. The spirit behind this is wonderful and indicates respect for the perspectives of the populations that you're serving. And what I would say is that there of course are various approaches and various processes for accomplishing any goal. If you're interested in a more bottoms-up approach, I would use a kind of focus group approach where I would bring a group of clients together and engage them in some variation of the questions that we have developed in our logic model development worksheet. They probably need to be made a little more plain English than what they are now. I'm sure they include some jargon that we're comfortable with as providers. But I would do a focus group and hear from clients what they have to say about how they see your work and your activities and your strategies, how they talk about them, and how they talk about the change that they've experienced. That is, doing it this way, the primary reward is that you're both collecting information that will help you build your evaluation framework, but you're also collecting evaluation data in the process. So when you ask about outcomes and how to talk about them, you can also ask to what degree they've experienced these outcomes, and that's a data collection opportunity. I think that I think the risks are minimal. I would simply say that if you are going to engage clients in this kind of a conversation, I would just be clear about what your intentions are, how it's going to benefit the work your organization does, which ultimately will benefit or should benefit your clients, and to just be clear about how the information will be used. The only risk is that you don't frame this in a way that is entirely clear or aligned with your intentions for using the information. And if the information, if clients discover you've used the information in a way that they weren't expecting, that would be an unfortunate situation to be in.
Wonderful. And our last question is, can you say a little bit about formative and summative evaluation and the relationship to process versus outcome evaluation? We typically look at our outcomes along the way and make adjustments in our programs, is John's question.
Wonderful, John. Congratulations on using outcomes on an ongoing basis to inform your practice and make adjustments in your programs. That is exactly how evaluation should be used. To your question about formative and summative evaluation and how that relates to process versus outcome, I find this to be often confused. Formative and summative evaluation is essentially a take on the purpose of the evaluation. So formative evaluation is referring to the use of evaluation on an ongoing basis in as much real time as possible to inform your work and to form and shape the work on an ongoing basis, as opposed to summative evaluation, which is the use of evaluation data to make conclusions at a given time point, to sum up what has been achieved and to make a conclusion about whether you successfully achieved what you had set out. Perhaps it was in a 3-year time frame or a 1 or 5-year time frame, whatever the case may be. Summative evaluation is about making that determination, yes, we did or did not achieve particular objectives. Formative evaluation is to say, what are we learning along the way here? How can it inform and adjust our practice? Process evaluation and outcome evaluation are important for both formative and summative. So you engage in process evaluation to understand implementation and how things are being implemented, how successful are we in being faithful to our intended approach and model. Outcome evaluation helps you understand whether, given how you implemented and given how you engaged in processes, what change did you affect. So you need to know something about your processes in order to understand how you've achieved your outcomes. You need to understand something about processes and outcomes to engage in either formative or summative evaluation. And I hope that that's clear. I know that it's complicated, and I also see that we are just about out of time.
That's right. We are drawing this session to a close. So much terrific information. I do want to let everyone know that we've recorded this session and we will be putting it up on GrantSpace so that you can access this recording and this presentation in the future. Watch for announcements about when that will happen, and you probably want to share it with your team. Any last words or summary points, Stephen?
I would simply say that I hope that if nothing else, you have found some source of entry into building your evaluation capacity to take a step in the direction of furthering your evaluation practice. It will support your ability to communicate with funders in a way that they understand. It will also improve your ability to deliver your services in the most effective way possible. And I very much appreciate everyone's time. There's a lot of additional information in the handbook, and hope that people find that to be a helpful resource.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Stephen. Really appreciate it. And please go to lfagroup.com/publications to download the handbook. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.